And again, tried to do this yesterday. In fact, I did do this yesterday, but forgot to turn it off, so it kept recording and probably had 2 hours worth of tape, and it was pretty worthless at that time. But just decided I'd come in and do this real quickly this morning, just knock it out so that those of you who were not here yesterday would have access to this. We talked on Friday, I believe it was, or Monday, whatever day it was, about some notable Georgians, some, of course, Georgia heroes. We talked about Elijah Clark, who was a commander in the Georgia militia. We talked about Austin Dabney, who was a slave fighting for his master. His master had sent him in his place. And then, of course, after the war, in 1786, actually, Georgia buys Austin Dabney from his owner and grants him his freedom, gives him land, which, if not wealthy in terms of money, he was certainly wealthy in terms of land at that time, especially for an African American in Georgia in the late 1780s. We talked about Nancy Hart, this larger-than-life woman, this almost mythical woman. The Creek Indians called her the war woman of Wauhatchie Creek. So she has this reputation, and of course, part of that reputation is built when she kills 6 loyalists or Tories who have come into her house to be fed and quartered. And she goes along with it, of course, with the idea of eventually capturing them or killing them. She ends up hanging. She and her husband end up hanging 4 of them, and she kills 2 with a gunshot. There's a video. You can go to georgiastories.com. It's right here. If you want to watch that, I would show it to you here, but you won't be able to hear it, so there's no need to do it. All right. We do know that this rumor, this myth surrounding Nancy Hart is more than likely true because of some evidence we uncovered in 1912. Railroad workers are digging new railway bed, and they uncover 6 skeletons in a mass grave. They are obviously soldiers. Their buckles and buttons and everything are in the grave with them. And so that kind of validates this rumor or the story about Nancy Hart. We do know she served as a spy. It was pretty easy for her to serve as a spy. She's a woman, and so she could just listen as she's serving meals, as she's just in the room. She could listen and then report to people like Elijah Clark. She also is purported to have fought in the Battle of Kettle Creek. Again, she's 6 feet tall, big for a person, not necessarily a woman, or not just a woman, but she was a big person, and she could easily pass for a male if she dressed properly. We have some political people that we'll look at. Go through these questions. There's like 11 of them that just ask about our Georgia heroes: Elijah Clark, Austin Dabney, and Nancy Hart. And then we're going to move into some political people. Button Gwinnett being the first one. Of course, Button Gwinnett is a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. If you remember, Georgia sent no one to the first one, but the second one they send 3 delegates. Button Gwinnett being one of them. He eventually signs the Declaration of Independence, and then comes back home. And what looks to be a very promising career turns pretty dismal pretty quickly. He is the chairman of the committee that writes the Georgia Constitution of 1777. He himself becomes governor in 1777, and that's when the wheels kind of fall off the bus, so to speak. He gets into a feud, a fight, an argument, a disagreement with a man named Lachlan McIntosh. Lachlan McIntosh is a brigadier general in the Continental Army. In fact, he is in charge of the Continental Army in Georgia. They get into a disagreement. McIntosh calls Gwinnett a liar and a scoundrel, which doesn't sound too bad to us today, but it was an attack on Gwinnett's character, on his integrity. And Gwinnett, he has a choice, but he makes a poor choice. He challenges Lachlan to a duel. Again, Lachlan's a professional soldier. Gwinnett is a politician. He's a lawyer. Both men are shot during the duel. McIntosh recovers. Gwinnett's femur is shattered by the bullet that hits him in the thigh. McIntosh is shot in the thigh as well. And Gwinnett actually dies 3 days after the duel. Again, don't duel with a professional soldier. If you're going to fight, pick somebody out you can beat. And he could not, there was no way it was going to turn out well for Button Gwinnett. This is not in your notes, just some stuff to give you some background. Governor Bullock dies, and upon his death, Gwinnett is appointed governor of Georgia in 1777. He's actually president of the Office of Public Safety, or Safety. We'll just call him the governor. But he was also chief of the militia. So he's in charge of the executive branch, but he's also in charge of the military of Georgia. McIntosh is appointed by the Continental Congress to be the commander of the Continental Battalion. So he's the leader, he's the commander of the Continental Army in Georgia. He would report to George Washington, not Button Gwinnett. Gwinnett doesn't like that arrangement. He wants to be in charge. And so he begins to talk to McIntosh's soldiers, his officers. He undermines his authority. He plants rumors about him. He does all sorts of things that are unethical, really. McIntosh is planning to invade, eastern Florida. Gwinnett thinks he can do it better, so he takes over that operation. Tries to plan it, tries to lead it, eventually acquiesces and allows one of McIntosh's subordinates to lead that expedition into Florida, and it fails. And that's a history lesson that we see repeated over and over and over, is when politicians try to plan and execute military operations, they usually fail. Gwinnett is charged with malfeasance, an inability to perform his duties. He's cleared of those charges, and things continue to spiral. Again, McIntosh really criticizes Gwinnett in public, again calls him a liar and a scoundrel, and Gwinnett challenges him to a duel. They meet in Thunderbolt, Georgia, which is near Savannah. May 16th, 1777. They're only about 12 feet from one another. So you would think they can't miss, but they're shooting smoothbore weapons, and there's a very good possibility they could miss. They don't. Both are wounded in the thigh. McIntosh recovers, but Gwinnett's wound is so grievous it becomes infected. He actually contracts gangrene, which basically his leg began to rot. It was dying. And, of course, the bacteria, the poison from that gangrene got into his bloodstream, and he died. So really a very promising career cut short by pride. He could have just let it go, but he didn't. Interesting pictures. You know, Lachlan McIntosh is back here in the back, and he looks distraught over what has happened to Button Gwinnett. He would not have been. He was perfectly okay with killing Button Gwinnett. Another picture, not any more historically accurate, but it is prettier. Again, they were 12 feet apart. That is not 12 feet. That's more like 3, 4, something like that. So anyway, there's actually a little video in here. You can go to, well, let me see what I can show you. Not that. Okay. Go if you want to see it, and it's worth looking at. Look up Lin-Manuel Miranda and Stephen Colbert perform Button. It's a little parody about Button Gwinnett. Kind of funny, kind of cute. You might enjoy it. You might not, but I've given it to you anyway. So, wish I could show it to you on this, but just doesn't work very well. Miss Karen and I were walking around in Savannah a couple of years ago. Started exploring a cemetery there, not the big one that everybody thinks of. This was a smaller cemetery, but it was interesting. We ran across a marker for Button Gwinnett. We don't know where Button Gwinnett's buried. He probably was originally buried in this cemetery, but we lost it. We don't know where they are. So we found this marker to Button Gwinnett, and of course, put there by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then maybe 20 feet away, we find the grave of General Lachlan McIntosh, complete with Georgia historical marker. And it's just kind of ironic that these two guys who became bitter enemies were or are united in death, buried, maybe 20 feet apart. We really don't know where Button Gwinnett's buried, but we're going to assume he's buried in that cemetery somewhere. Lyman Hall's both a minister and a doctor. He's trained as a minister first, then he becomes a medical doctor. He also is a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration, and like Gwinnett, he is governor of Georgia, elected in 1783. Really, the second state governor. What we call statehood governor, elected in 1783. Probably his greatest legacy is he's a founding father of the University of Georgia. He's very instrumental in starting that university. George Walton, without a doubt, the most politically successful of the signers of the Declaration from Georgia. He's a lawyer. He's also a soldier. He is wounded and captured at the siege of Savannah, and one has to wonder or question why the British don't execute him. He is a traitor. He's guilty of treason. He signed the Declaration. Yet, for some reason, that doesn't happen to him. He has a very lengthy career after the war, some 30 years. He's a representative in the U.S. House. He's a circuit court judge. He's the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. He is the governor of Georgia, and he also serves as a U.S. Senator. So George Walton accomplishes a lot during his career after the Revolutionary War. All right. So in Augusta, we have this monument. It's called the Signers Monument. And George Walton and Lyman Hall are actually buried underneath this monument. The rumor about, it wasn't rumor. They were trying to find Gwinnett's body to reinter him here and couldn't find it. Again, it's lost to history somewhere in Savannah. But if you're in Augusta, stop by and look at the Signers Monument, take your picture with it. And yeah. All right. A couple other questions. Let me go back. So you got those. Really simple, all about Gwinnett, Hall, and Walton. You can stop this and answer those questions. Let's move on for just a few brief minutes into our last section of notes. We have, of course, gained independence. But what do you do with it? I mean, how do you proceed with with things after you've won the war. We're going to look at a couple of documents. We're going to look at the Georgia Constitution of 1777. Then we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation of 1777 and look at a 12-year period. How did these documents influence the government of Georgia and the United States? So let's start with the Georgia Constitution of 1777. It's based upon those principles we find in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what the Constitution is founded on, this Constitution of 1777, those principles. It's not a very strong document. It's not a document that enables the government to do what the government needs to do. But it does have some strong points. It does have some weaknesses, and we'll look at those in a moment. It does create three branches of government. Of course, the legislative that makes law, the executive that executes or enforces the law, and then finally the judicial branch that interprets the law. Pretty sure I didn't mention when we were talking about the Declaration of Independence, when it was first printed, it was printed and it looked like this. It looked like it was in a newspaper. And that's because it was. John Dunlap, who's the printer to Congress, prints, I don't know how many copies of the Declaration. It's dispersed throughout the colonies to be read to the Continental Army, to be read at the General Assemblies of the colonies, and just to be printed in the newspaper, to be read on the street corner. It's not until a couple of days after July 4th that John Dunlap is ordered to create engrossed copies, and that's those copies we usually think of when we think of the Declaration with John Hancock's big swooping signature. Anyway, that's what it would have looked like in 1776 as it was being dispersed to the people. This is Georgia's Constitution of 1777. Again, it would have been printed. People would have had access to it. All right. So what about it? It creates a legislature, but it is a unicameral legislature. It is a one-house legislature. And because of that, the legislature has way too much power. The legislature appoints the governor. It appoints members of the judicial branch. So you have one branch of government that is essentially controlling the other two. The governor is only able to serve a one-year term, so he's pretty powerless. If you've ever heard the expression, a lame duck, the governor's a lame duck when he takes office. He just doesn't have time to accomplish very much. It does create a superior court for each county, and it does grant Georgia citizens some freedoms. First of all, there's freedom of the press. The press is free to print whatever, as long as it's true. If it's true, then of course not true, then there are repercussions. There's freedom of religion. People are free to choose what or how or if they worship. And then each Georgia citizen is guaranteed a trial by jury. If they're arrested for a crime, they will be given the opportunity to stand trial before a jury. And that's an old English right, old British right that carries over. It does have some strengths. There is a separation of the government branches. The problem is they're really all three controlled by one group. There's that protection of basic rights, those things that John Locke talked about, those rights that Thomas Jefferson wrote about that we just mentioned, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's way too many weaknesses in this document. The legislature, as I mentioned, has too much power. They basically rule every aspect of the state. They elect the governor, they elect his council, they elect all state officials, the legislature. And so it's too strong. There's only one house, so there's no check on its power. You probably are aware of how a bill becomes a law. It has to pass the House, or it has to pass the Senate, and then it goes to the other house, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, and then it goes to the president to either be signed into law or vetoed. That doesn't happen under this particular arrangement. The legislature has all the power. If they pass a bill, it becomes a law. And again, the governor only has this one-year term, so his effectiveness is very limited. All right, there's Button Gwinnett again. Needs to shave. And the Constitution was never ratified by the people. When the U.S. Constitution was written, it was ratified by the people or by the states. This did not happen, and because of it, it really doesn't represent the interest of the people of Georgia. It represents the interest of those who are in power. Despite all of that, it is the Constitution for a 12-year period. It mirrors the same 12-year period that the Articles of Confederation governed the United States. And they're very similar documents. They both have some of the same strengths and weaknesses. Here's John Troutland. John Troutland becomes the first governor elected constitutionally. In other words, under the plan set up in the Constitution of 1777. He actually takes over for Button Gwinnett. All right, we're going to stop there, I believe, and hopefully you'll be back soon.